The morning sun cast long shadows across Main Street as Harold Mitchell, a 93-year-old veteran, pulled his old Chevrolet into his usual parking spot at Sally's Diner. His weathered hands, marked with age spots and old scars, gripped the steering wheel firmly as he completed his daily parking routine. Every morning for the past 40 years, Harold had followed the same schedule, arriving precisely at 7 a.m. for his breakfast. The bell above the diner's door chimed softly as Harold pushed it open. The familiar smell of coffee and fresh bacon greeted him, along with Sally's warm smile from behind the counter. At 93, Harold moved slower than he used to, but he carried himself with the same dignity that had marked his years of military service. His pressed khaki pants and neatly ironed blue button-down shirt showed his attention to detail hadn't faded with age. "Morning, Mr. Mitchell," called Sally, already pouring his usual black coffee into his favorite blue mug. "The usual today?" Harold nodded, carefully settling into his regular booth by the window. The leather seat had a slight depression where he sat every day, like an old friend welcoming him back. He placed his worn leather wallet on the table and pulled out a faded photograph he always carried with him, a black and white image of young soldiers standing proud in their uniforms. The diner was quiet at this early hour, with only a few regular customers scattered around. Tom, the newspaper delivery man, waved from his spot at the counter. Mary, a retired schoolteacher, smiled warmly from her corner table. These familiar faces were part of Harold's daily routine, a comfort in his twilight years. As Sally brought over his wheat toast and scrambled eggs, Harold's eyes drifted to the street outside. The town had changed so much since he first started coming here. The old hardware store across the street was now a coffee shop, and the bookstore 2 doors down had become a mobile phone store. But Sally's Diner remained the same, a constant in a changing world. Harold's mind wandered back to his younger days as he sipped his coffee. The hot liquid warmed his hands, which still felt the phantom way of his rifle from those distant war days. He had been just 19 when he joined the army, leaving behind his small hometown and everything familiar to fight in a war across the ocean. The sound of motorcycles approaching broke through his thoughts. Harold watched as 3 large bikes pulled into the parking lot, their engines unnecessarily loud in the quiet morning air. This was something new. He had never seen bikers at the diner this early before. The riders were young men dressed in leather jackets covered in patches and logos he didn't recognize. As the bikers walked past his window, Harold noticed them looking at his car with smirks on their faces. One pointed at the vehicle and said something that made the others laugh. Harold felt a familiar tension in his shoulders, the same feeling he used to get during his military days when trouble was brewing. Sally appeared at his table with a fresh cup of coffee, her eyes also watching the bikers as they entered the diner. "Don't you worry about them, Mr. Mitchell," she said softly, though her voice carried a note of concern. "They've been coming in for the past few days, usually later though." Harold thanked her with a slight nod, his blue eyes never leaving the newcomers as they settled into a booth across the room. Their loud voices and rough laughter filled the previously peaceful space, changing the entire atmosphere of the diner. Other regular customers began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. Looking down at the photograph in his hands, Harold studied the faces of his old unit. They had faced real trouble together, survived things these young men couldn't imagine. He carefully tucked the photo back into his wallet, straightened his shoulders, and continued with his breakfast. Whatever these bikers might bring, he had seen worse. Much worse. Little did Harold know that this morning would mark the beginning of a confrontation that would not only change his quiet routine, but would remind everyone in town about the true meaning of courage, respect, and the unexpected ways that wisdom can bridge generational gaps. The peaceful breakfast routine he had maintained for 40 years was about to be disrupted in ways he couldn't imagine. The next morning, Harold arrived at Sally's Diner to find his usual parking spot blocked by 3 motorcycles. They were parked at odd angles, taking up more space than necessary. Harold's hands tightened on his steering wheel as he recognized the bikes from yesterday. After driving around the block twice, he finally found a spot much further down the street. The walk to the diner was longer than he was used to, and his right knee, injured during the war, protested with each step. By the time he reached the diner's door, he could hear the bikers' loud laughter from inside. The peaceful morning atmosphere he loved had vanished. As Harold pushed open the door, one of the bikers stuck out his foot, nearly tripping the old veteran. "Watch your step, Grandpa," the young man said with a smirk. His leather jacket had a patch that read "Snake" across the shoulder. The other bikers at the table snickered. Sally, who had seen everything from behind the counter, rushed over with Harold's coffee. Her face was red with anger, but Harold gently shook his head at her. He had handled worse situations in his life. Much worse. He made his way to a different booth, since the bikers had taken his usual spot by the window. "Hey, old-timer," called out another biker with a skull tattoo on his neck. "That ancient car outside yours. The blue Cheppy? Surprised it still runs. Must be as old as you are." More laughter followed. Harold sipped his coffee quietly, his face calm despite the taunts. He watched as other regular customers hurried through their meals, clearly uncomfortable with the new atmosphere in the diner. Mary, the retired teacher, left without finishing her toast. Tom, the newspaperman, didn't even stay for his usual second cup of coffee. The bikers grew louder as the morning went on. They played rough music from their phones, swore loudly, and made rude comments about everyone who walked past their table. Sally tried to ask them to keep it down, but they just ignored her. When Harold pulled out his old photograph to look at it, as he did every morning, one of the bikers noticed. "What's that you got there, Pops?" The one called Snake walked over and snatched the photo from Harold's hands before he could stop him. "Well, look at this, boys." Snake held up the black and white photograph. "Grandpa's got some old war picture. Bet these guys were real tough back in the Stone Age." He waved the photo around carelessly, its edges bending in his rough grip. Harold's heart raced as he watched his precious photograph being manhandled. That picture had been with him through decades. It showed him and his unit just before they headed into the Battle of the Bulge. 3 of the men in that photo never made it home. "Please return that to me," Harold said quietly, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "It's very important." "Important? It's just an old piece of paper." Snake laughed, holding the photo higher. "What's so special about it?" The diner had gone completely silent. Even the kitchen staff had stopped what they were doing to watch. Sally stood behind the counter, her hand covering her mouth in worry. "Those men," Harold said, slowly standing up from his booth, "were my brothers. Not by blood, but by something stronger. We fought together, bled together, and some of them died together." His voice remained calm, but there was steel in it now. Snake's smile faltered slightly, but he tried to maintain his tough guy act. "Yeah? And what's that got to do with us?" "Those men," Harold continued, now standing straight despite his age, "fought and died for the freedom you enjoy today. The freedom that allows you to sit in this diner and act like foolish children who never learned respect." The other bikers had stopped laughing. Something in Harold's voice, in his steady gaze and straight shoulders, made them shift uncomfortably in their seats. The old man standing before them suddenly seemed different. Not just some elderly regular at a diner, but something more. Snake still held the photograph, but his hand had lowered slightly. The atmosphere in the diner had changed completely, and everyone could feel that this moment was building toward something important. Harold Mitchell, 93-year-old veteran, was about to teach these young men a lesson they would never forget. 3. The silence in Sally's diner grew heavier as Harold stood face to face with Snake, who still held the precious photograph. The morning sun streaming through the windows seemed to highlight the difference between them, the young biker in his leather jacket covered with patches, and the elderly veteran in his neat, pressed clothes. "You want to know what's special about that photograph?" Harold asked, his voice growing stronger with each word. "The man on the far left, that's Jimmy Connor. He saved my life in Belgium when German tanks surrounded us. He died 3 days later, carrying a wounded soldier to safety." Harold's blue eyes never left Snake's face as he spoke. Snake's tough expression started to crack. His fingers loosened slightly on the photograph's edges. Behind him, his fellow bikers had stopped their laughing and joking, drawn in by Harold's words. "The tall fellow in the middle, that's Robert Martinez," Harold continued, taking a small step forward. "He had a wife and baby daughter back home he never got to see again. He stepped on a landmine while leading our unit through a minefield. Saved 30 men that day by finding the safe path, until he made one wrong step." Sally wiped tears from her eyes behind the counter. Other customers in the diner had turned in their seats to listen, their breakfasts forgotten. Even the kitchen staff stood in the doorway, watching the scene unfold. "And that young man there, the one smiling." Harold pointed to the photograph, his hand steady despite his age. "That's me, 19 years old, thinking I knew everything about the world. I learned more about life, death, and courage in the next few months than most people learn in a lifetime. Snake looked down at the photograph again, but this time with different eyes. He could see the young faces clearly now, their uniforms crisp, their expressions a mix of pride and uncertainty. These weren't just faces in an old picture anymore, they were real people with real stories. We faced real enemies, Harold said, his voice firm but not angry. Men who would shoot you dead without a second thought. We fought against people who believed that bullying and intimidation made them strong. And you know what we learned? The biker called Snake slowly lowered the photograph. One of his friends at the table shifted uncomfortably in his seat, removing his sunglasses and hanging his head slightly. We learned that real strength isn't about making others feel small, Harold continued. It's not about loud motorcycles or tough-looking jackets or scaring old folks at breakfast. Real strength is about standing up for what's right, protecting those who need protection, and showing respect for the sacrifices of others. An older man sitting at the counter stood up suddenly, removing his cap. "Second Infantry Division," he said quietly. "My father served too." Others in the diner began to nod, some sharing quiet words about fathers, uncles, and grandfathers who had served. Snake looked around the diner, then back at Harold. For the first time, his tough guy mask completely fell away, revealing a young man who suddenly seemed much younger than his years. His hands trembled slightly as he carefully straightened the photograph's bent corners. I'm sorry, sir," Snake said, his voice barely above a whisper. He held out the photograph with both hands, treating it now like the precious object it was. "My grandfather, he served in the Pacific. He never talked about it much, but I should have known better." Harold took the photograph gently, inspecting it for damage. As he did so, Snake remained standing there, no longer the intimidating biker, but just a young man learning a hard lesson about respect and dignity. "Your grandfather," Harold said softly, "would want you to be better than this. All those who served, who sacrificed, who never came home, they didn't do it so you could become the kind of person they fought against." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The other bikers at the table had removed their sunglasses too, their faces showing shame and understanding. The tension in the diner had changed from fear to something else. A moment of transformation, of lessons being learned, of wisdom being passed from one generation to another. After Harold's powerful words, the atmosphere in Sally's diner had changed completely. Snake stood there, still processing the lesson he had just learned, while his fellow bikers remained unusually quiet at their table. Sally took this moment to bring fresh coffee to everyone, her way of helping ease the tension in the room. "Sir," Snake said, clearing his throat, Would you tell us more about them? The men in the photo?" His voice had lost all its previous mockery, replaced by genuine interest and a touch of shame. Harold looked at the young man for a long moment, seeing past the tough exterior to something familiar, something he had seen in young soldiers many years ago. He gestured to the empty seats at his table. "Sit down, boys," he said quietly. "I'll tell you about real toughness." The bikers moved to Harold's table, leaving their usual booth empty. As they settled in, other customers in the diner slowly returned to their meals, though many kept glancing over, interested in what would happen next. "Before I tell you about my unit," Harold said, carefully placing the photograph on the table where everyone could see it, "I want to know about you boys. What makes you want to scare old folks and act tough in a peaceful diner?" Snake, whose real name turned out to be James, looked down at his hands. "I guess we thought it made us look cool. Strong. Like nobody could mess with us." The other bikers nodded in agreement. "Let me tell you about real strength," Harold said, pointing to another man in the photograph. "See this fellow here? That's Frank Thompson. He was the smallest guy in our unit. The Germans had surrounded us in the Ardennes forest. It was during the Battle of the Bulge, winter of '44. Frank crawled through the snow for 6 hours, dodging enemy patrols, to get word to headquarters about our position." The bikers leaned in closer, their breakfast forgotten, as Harold continued. "He was freezing, scared to death, but he kept going. Saved our whole unit. Never bragged about it, never acted tough. Just did what needed to be done." Sally brought over plates of eggs and toast on the house as Harold shared more stories. He told them about the night they liberated a small French village, how they shared their rations with hungry children. He described the bond between soldiers, how they looked out for each other regardless of where they came from or what they looked like. The thing about real courage, Harold explained, buttering his toast, is that it's not about making others afraid. It's about doing what's right, even when you're scared. It's about protecting others, not bullying them. James, formerly known as Snake, removed his leather jacket, revealing a simple black t-shirt underneath. On his forearm was a small tattoo of military dog tags. "These were my grandfather's," he said quietly. "He died last year. Never told me much about his service. Said it was too hard to talk about." Harold nodded understanding. "Many of us found it hard to talk about, but maybe that's been a mistake. Maybe we should have told more stories, helped young folks understand what really matters." The morning had stretched into early afternoon, but nobody seemed to notice the time passing. The bikers listened intently as Harold shared more memories, not just of battles and bravery, but of friendship, sacrifice, and the real meaning of strength. "You boys have got good hearts," Harold said finally, looking at each of them. "I can see that, but you've been showing the world your worst selves instead of your best." The bikers exchanged glances, something new in their eyes, understanding, respect, and maybe a touch of purpose they hadn't had before. "We want to do better, sir," James said, speaking for the group. Could we come back tomorrow? Hear more stories?" Harold smiled, his first real smile since the bikers had started coming to the diner. "Same time tomorrow," he said. "But first, I think you boys have some apologies to make, to Sally, to the other customers you've scared away, and to this fine establishment." The bikers nodded, standing up with new purpose. The transformation that had begun with a confrontation over a photograph was about to change not just these young men, but the entire community around them. The next morning, Sally's diner looked different. The bikers had arrived early, but instead of blocking Harold's parking spot, they had saved it for him. James, no longer called Snake, and his friends stood respectfully as Harold's blue Chevrolet pulled up. "Good morning, sir," James said, opening the car door for Harold. Another biker, Mike, offered his arm to help Harold step out of the car. The old veteran accepted their help with a small nod, noticing how the young men had cleaned up their appearance. Their leather jackets were neat, their hair combed, and their usual tough guy expressions replaced with genuine smiles. Inside the diner, customers watched in amazement as the once rowdy bikers escorted Harold to his usual booth by the window. Sally brought over coffee for everyone, beaming at the changed atmosphere in her restaurant. The regular customers who had been staying away started returning, curious about the transformation they'd heard about. "We did what you said, sir," James reported as they settled in. "Yesterday afternoon, we went around town apologizing to everyone we bothered. Even fixed Mrs. Thompson's fence that we knocked over last week with our bikes." Harold stirred his coffee, a proud look in his eyes. "That's a good start, boys. But tell me, how did it make you feel?" The bikers exchanged glances before Mike spoke up. "It felt good, actually. Mrs. Thompson even made us lemonade while we worked. Nobody's ever really been nice to us like that before." "That's because you never gave them a chance to be," Harold said gently. He pulled out his wallet and removed the photograph, but this time he had brought something else too, an old, worn medal in a small velvet box. "This is the Bronze Star," Harold explained, carefully opening the box. "I received it not for fighting, but for saving lives. We were in a small Belgian town, and I noticed a group of children playing near an unexploded bomb. Didn't speak their language, but sometimes actions speak louder than words." The bikers leaned forward, their eyes fixed on the medal as Harold continued. "Spent 2 hours slowly leading those kids away and marking the area until the disposal unit could arrive. No gunfire, no violence, just doing what needed to be done to protect others." Tom, the newspaper delivery man who had been listening nearby, suddenly spoke up. "Hey, I remember that story. My father wrote about it in the local paper when you came back. Said you never wanted any recognition for it." Harold nodded. "Recognition isn't why we do the right thing. We do it because it's right." He looked at each of the young bikers. "Just like you boys did yesterday, fixing that fence and making those apologies." James reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Sir, we've been thinking. We want to do more. We made a list of ways we could help around town." He handed the paper to Harold, who unfolded it carefully. The list included things like help elderly residents with yard work, volunteer at the Veterans Center, start a motorcycle safety program for kids, and escort service for elderly shoppers. Sally, who had been refilling coffee cups nearby, wiped a tear from her eye. Other customers in the diner were listening now, moved by the change they were witnessing. "This," Harold said, tapping the list with his finger, "this is real strength. This is what my brothers fought for. Not just to defeat an enemy, but to build something better. To create a community where people help each other." The morning sun streamed through the diner's windows, casting a warm glow over the unlikely group. The elderly veteran and the reformed bikers, sharing breakfast and planning ways to make their community better. "You know what, boys?" Harold said, a twinkle in his eye. "I think my old unit would be proud to have you carrying on their legacy. Not with violence or intimidation, but with service and respect." The bikers sat straighter in their seats, feeling the weight of Harold's words and the responsibility that came with them. What had started as a confrontation over a photograph was growing into something much bigger, a mission to transform not just themselves, but their entire community. Word spread quickly through the small town about the transformation at Sally's Diner. More people started showing up in the mornings, not just for breakfast, but to witness the remarkable friendship between Harold and his unlikely new companions. The diner had become the headquarters for what people were calling the Veterans' Guardians, the former troublemakers who now dedicated their time to community service. One morning, about 2 weeks after the confrontation over the photograph, Harold arrived to find the diner unusually crowded. James and the other bikers were there as usual, but so were several reporters from the local newspaper and even a TV crew from the nearest city. "What's all this about?" Harold asked as James helped him to his usual booth. "Well, sir," James replied, looking slightly nervous, "we wanted to surprise you. Remember that list we made? We've been busy this past week making it happen." Mike stepped forward with a laptop computer and opened it on the table. "We created a website, sir, called it Veterans Guardians, continuing the legacy of service. We've already got 50 members from other motorcycle clubs in the region who want to join our mission." Harold watched as they showed him pictures on the screen. There were images of the bikers helping elderly veterans with yard work, escorting seniors to grocery stores, and teaching motorcycle safety to kids at the local school. Each biker wore a new patch on their jacket, a design that incorporated elements of Harold's old unit insignia, with the words, "Strength through service," beneath it. "But that's not all," James continued, his voice filled with pride. "Remember Mrs. Thompson, whose fence we fixed? Her son works at the Veterans Affairs office. He helped us set up a proper organization. We're now officially registered as a non-profit group dedicated to helping veterans and elderly citizens." Sally brought over Harold's usual breakfast, her face beaming. "Tell them about Saturday," she prompted the bikers. Mike grinned. "This Saturday, we're organizing the first Veterans Ride for Honor. Motorcycle clubs from 3 states are coming. Each rider has to sponsor a veteran, take them for a ride if they're able, or contribute to our new Veterans Support Fund if they're not." Harold sat quietly, taking it all in. The reporters waited nearby, cameras rolling, capturing the moment. The old veteran looked at each of the young men standing around his table, remembering how different they had been just weeks ago. "You know," Harold said finally, his voice thick with emotion, "when I was your age, I thought I knew what victory looked like. Thought it was about defeating enemies and winning battles." He paused, looking at the photos on the laptop screen. "But this is what real victory looks like. This is what we fought for." One of the reporters stepped forward. "Mr. Mitchell, how does it feel to see your confrontation with these young men turn into such a positive movement?" Harold smiled. "In the war, we learned that the biggest changes often start with the smallest moments. Sometimes it just takes one person standing up for what's right, and others will follow. These boys," he gestured to the bikers, "they just needed someone to believe in them, to remind them of their better selves." James cleared his throat. "Sir, there's one more thing." He nodded to Mike, who went to the diner's door and opened it. Outside, lined up along the street, were dozens of motorcycles. Their riders stood at attention, each wearing the new Veterans Guardians patch. "They're all here for you, sir," James explained. "Each one has pledged to help veterans in their own communities, to carry on the legacy of service you taught us about. We're not just changing our town, we're starting a movement." Harold looked out at the rows of motorcycles and their riders, then back at the photograph of his old unit that still sat in his wallet. He thought about how proud his old brothers in arms would be to see their legacy living on in such an unexpected way. The morning sun glinted off the chrome of the motorcycles outside, and the diner buzzed with excitement. What had started as a confrontation between an old veteran and a group of troublemakers had grown into something much bigger, a reminder that it's never too late to change, to make a difference, and to stand up for what's right. The Saturday of the first Veterans Ride for Honor dawned bright and clear. Harold arrived at Sally's diner earlier than usual, wearing his old military medals on his neatly pressed jacket. The diner had been transformed into the event's headquarters, with red, white, and blue banners hanging from the windows and a large Veterans Guardians Welcome Center sign over the door. "Good morning, sir," James called out, rushing to help Harold from his car. Today, James looked different. Gone were all traces of his former snake persona. His leather jacket now displayed military service pins collected from veterans he had helped, and the Veterans Guardians patch gleamed on his back. Inside the diner, Sally had outdone herself. The counters were loaded with free breakfast for all veterans and riders, and the walls were covered with photographs, both old military photos from local veterans and new ones showing the bikers' community service work. Harold's famous photograph held the place of honor in the center. "Sir, we have someone special for you to meet," Mike said, leading Harold to a quiet corner booth. There sat an elderly man in a wheelchair, wearing a Marine Corps cap. "This is James's grandfather. He flew in from Arizona for today's event." James's grandfather looked up at Harold with tears in his eyes. "Mr. Mitchell," he said, his voice shaking slightly, "I can't thank you enough for what you've done for my grandson. When his parents died in that car accident 10 years ago, he lost his way. But you helped him find his purpose again." Harold sat down across from the former Marine, and James joined them. Outside, the rumble of motorcycles grew louder as more riders arrived from across the country. The Veterans Guardians movement had spread faster than anyone expected, with chapters forming in 12 states in just 2 weeks. "Your grandson," Harold replied, "and all these young men, they just needed to be reminded of who they could be. Sometimes the toughest people are the ones with the biggest hearts, once they find their true path." The diner's door kept opening and closing as more people arrived. Veterans of all ages came in, some walking tall, others in wheelchairs or with canes, each greeted with respect and honor by the bikers. The local TV crews had returned, along with reporters from national networks who had picked up the story. "Mr. Mitchell," called a young reporter, "how does it feel to see your stand against bullying turn into a national veterans support movement?" Before Harold could answer, James spoke up. "If I may, sir." Harold nodded, and James turned to the reporters. "What Mr. Mitchell taught us wasn't just about stopping bullying. It showed us what real strength looks like. It's not about intimidation or fear. It's about service, respect, and standing up for what's right." The diner had become packed with people, but a respectful hush fell as Harold slowly stood up. "You know," he said, his clear voice carrying across the room, "during the war, we fought against people who thought strength came from causing fear and pain. We learned that real strength comes from protecting others, from lifting people up instead of pushing them down." He looked around at the gathered crowd, the reformed bikers, the proud veterans, the community members who had come to support them. "What these young men have done," he continued, "is prove that it's never too late to change, to choose a better path. They've taken the legacy of service that my generation fought for and given it new life." Outside, the sound of motorcycles had grown to a thunder as hundreds of riders gathered for the event. Each bike bore the Veterans Guardians patch, and each rider had committed to the mission of service and respect that had started in this small diner. "Today," Harold said, his voice growing stronger, "when we ride out together, old veterans and young guardians, we're not just celebrating the past. We're building a future where strength means something better, where being tough means being kind, and where standing up for others is the greatest victory of all." The morning sun streamed through the diner's windows, glinting off military medals and motorcycle chrome alike. What had begun as a confrontation between an old veteran and a group of troubled young men had grown into something none of them could have imagined. A movement that was changing lives across the nation, one act of service at a time. 1 year had passed since the day Harold first stood up to the bikers in Sally's diner. The small restaurant had changed a lot since then. New photographs covered its walls, pictures of Veterans Guardians chapters from across the country, news clippings about their good works, and at the center, the original photograph of Harold's unit that had started it all. On this special morning, Harold sat in his usual booth, but he wasn't alone. James, Mike, and dozens of other Veterans Guardians filled the diner. Sally moved between tables with coffee and breakfast, wearing a special apron with the Veterans Guardians logo that the bikers had given her. "Sir," James said, standing up to address everyone, "we have something special to share with you today." He nodded to Mike, who wheeled in a covered display board. This past year, the Veterans Guardians have grown to over 10,000 members in all 50 states. But more importantly, look at what we've accomplished. Mike removed the cover to reveal a large board filled with numbers and photographs. "We've helped repair 1,500 homes for elderly veterans," James announced proudly, "provided 20,000 free rides to medical appointments, started 200 youth mentorship programs, and raised over $2 million for veterans support services." Harold looked at the board with tears in his eyes. Each number represented lives changed, people helped, and communities strengthened. But what touched him most were the photographs. Bikers in their leather jackets, now bearing the Veterans Guardians patch, helping elderly veterans, playing with children, and working in communities across the nation. "But that's not all," Mike added, pulling out an envelope. "Remember that medal you showed us, sir? The Bronze Star. Well, we wrote to the president about what you've done here, about how one man's courage not only changed our lives but sparked a movement that's helping veterans across America." James opened the envelope and pulled out an official letter. "The president has awarded you the Presidential Citizens Medal, sir, for transforming a moment of confrontation into a nationwide movement of service and respect." The diner erupted in applause. Sally wiped tears from her eyes as she brought out a special cake decorated with military and Veterans Guardian symbols. Through the windows, Harold could see hundreds of motorcycles parked outside, their riders gathering for the first anniversary celebration of the Veterans Ride for Honor. "You know what makes me proudest?" Harold said, his voice clear and strong despite his age. "Not the medal, not the numbers on that board. What makes me proud is seeing how you boys found your true strength. You turned from causing fear to spreading hope. That's a victory bigger than any I won in the war." Tom, the newspaper man, spoke up from his spot at the counter. "My son joined the Veterans Guardians chapter in California," he said. "Says it changed his life. Now he's helping homeless veterans find homes and jobs." More people shared stories about bikers who had become mentors to troubled youth, about veterans who had found new purpose in life, about communities that had been brought together. The Veterans Guardians had become more than just a motorcycle club. They had become a symbol of transformation and hope. "When I first walked into this diner a year ago," James said, "I thought being tough meant making others afraid. Mr. Mitchell taught us that real toughness is about having the courage to help others, to admit when you're wrong, and to choose a better path." Harold looked around at the faces in the diner, the reformed bikers who had become like sons to him, Sally who had witnessed it all, the community members who had supported their transformation, and all the veterans who had found new hope through the movement. "My old unit," Harold said, touching the photograph on the wall. "They fought for a better world. And looking around this room, seeing what you've all become, I know they didn't fight in vain. You've proven that it's never too late to change, that one moment of courage can transform countless lives, and that the greatest strength lies not in causing fear, but in bringing hope." The morning sun shone through the diner's windows, casting a warm glow over the gathering. What had begun as a confrontation between an old veteran and a group of troublemakers had become a legacy of service, respect, and transformation that would continue to change lives for generations to come.